you all for coming. My name's Dean Godson. I'm Director of Policy Exchange, and it's a privilege to be able to reopen the political season here at Policy Exchange with our guest of honour today. The relationship between Britain and Australia, though of course of great importance to both countries, nonetheless has entered in some ways at a political and policy level a new golden era. We look more than ever before to Australia for encouragement, for precedent. We look to Australia. We recently this summer had Sir Linton Crosby here invoking Sir Robert Menzies' Forgotten People. We have, of course, Sir Linton as a leading figure in the political strategies and life of this country. Alexander Downer, another fellow South Australian, was, of course, High Commissioner here. We have the pleasure of him as being our Chair of Trustees. And, of course, many lessons were and are being imbibed from the victory of Scott Morrison. I think we have somewhere here in the room, just to ensure that it isn't all about Liberals and Conservatives, John McTernan. Where are you? Somewhere. John, welcome, just of course as Tony Blair's last political secretary, of course subsequently a prominent figure in the councils of Julie Gillard when she was Prime Minister. So a very warm welcome to you as well. And it's a particular pleasure also to be able to welcome the Honourable George Brandis, current High Commissioner of Australia, of course, a distinguished former Attorney General in his own right. Welcome to you, George. It's now a great pleasure. Tony, you've been a great friend to us through the years. You've come to many of our events at conference. I slightly take the view that what happens in Birmingham stays in Birmingham, but it's always good to hear you at the policy level. I know that you've got a real zinger for us today, which will make this last-minute attendance of so many people, a full house, such a tribute to you, all the more worthwhile. So thank you for coming today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say, and you'll be answering questions afterwards.
Well, Dean, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I have long wanted to make a serious speech about Brexit. I never imagined that it would turn out to be at such a fraught time. But the argument over leaving the European Union is Britain's least civil and most seismic disagreement, at least since the Irish question a century or so back, that shaved off part of the country and irrevocably split the Liberal Party. Yes, it is that serious. And allow me, please, to make a declaration at the outset that I want what's best for Britain. Not because of my birth. My citizenship was renounced some 30 years ago, but because it is in the best interests of the wider world that Britain be strong. And Britain can't be its full strength without also being free. Free to set its own course and to chart its own future. Let's start with a little thought experiment. I suppose it's not entirely beyond anyone's comprehension that Australia might form a union with New Zealand, given that our Constitution's founders envisaged that our trans-Tasman siblings might once have joined our Commonwealth, or even that we might somehow have a union of sorts with PNG, that was once our colony. But would anyone imagine, even in a wild fantasy, a Southeast Asian parliament with a supranational government based, say, in Singapore, attempting to make rules for countries as diverse as Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam and Thailand, merely because we share a neighbourhood and the imagined alternative is war between us? Now, given Europe's blood-stained history, it is easy to see the necessity of a close alliance between one-time foes so that the generals of each country see each other as brothers in arms rather than as military rivals. And given the glories of Christendom, it's easy to grasp nostalgia for a Europe with a common faith and a common culture where the ruling elites feel as at home with each other as once did a series of interrelated royal families. But this idea of 28 quasi-independent countries, large and small, relatively rich and relatively poor, all with different languages, different histories, different ancient attachments and different ancient antagonisms, all needing to act in unison, all heeding the same faceless Brussels bureaucrats and worshipping at the altar of climate change and uncontrolled borders. Well, if this nostrum were put forward in an Australian pub, the response would be, tell them they're dreaming. And that would be the polite version, because this is not a formula for leadership, but for paralysis. Now, as a free trade zone to promote mutual prosperity between relatively well-off neighbours, the European Economic Community, as it then was, made much sense. That's what Britain belatedly voted to join back in 1975. It's just that the evolution by stealth of this free trade zone, even then showing signs of Fortress Europe with its wine lakes and butter mountains, without its inhabitants ever really being asked or being ignored and bypassed if they ever had the temerity to say stop, that had always been planned by those at the heart of Europe in order to create a new entity commanding more loyalty than its member states. And yes, the conservative instinct that I completely understand and share is not to change without good reason, because change is often far more trouble than it's worth. But when change must happen, because the people want it, because they want a polity that's fully accountable to them, it's not reform so much as restoration that's called for, in this case, restoration of the free trade with the major countries of Europe that Britain thought it had signed up for back in 1972. Now, whenever the citizens of the different countries of Europe have been asked what they thought of ever closer union, their first response has always been to reject it. And oblivious to the ever-widening democratic deficit, the high priests of Europe have always found ways to subvert every outbreak of independence or of national feeling, through legal back channels or through bullying the local establishment into second votes until the poor old benighted majority of voters could be brought to see just how misguided they'd been. That's what's happening in Britain right now. The people voted to leave, but the establishment wants to stay. It's a revolt of the minority against the majority, of the elites against the voters, of the parliament against the people, of those who think Big Brother knows best against those who think that Jack really is as good as his master. I've heard it myself, again and again, from the lips of good and decent people who would not normally scorn the articles of democratic faith, that some voters count more than others, and that you just can't trust ordinary people to know what's in their own best interest, especially when their view doesn't coincide with mine. Now, would the British people have voted to stay in the EU had they known how Brussels officialdom would work against them, or how much Britain's Remain voting top civil servants, professors and public company directors patronised them? Hardly. Now that voters know that Brexit might, just might, mean hold-ups at airports and wharves while the EU works out what it wants to do, and fewer tourists, job losses and an investment drought until the uncertainty subsides, surely, say the Ramonas, people would not have voted for it. But hang on, that's exactly what Project Fear predicted the first time round, and vote for it is exactly what the British people did. So no, the second vote movement is not a fight for democracy, it's just a hypocritical bid to overturn the first vote by the losers who didn't like its result. Theresa May was right at the outset when she insisted that Brexit meant Brexit. What's happening now is a determined campaign to stop Brexit happening at all, or to ensure that it's a Brexit that doesn't change anything under the May deal, because for years to come, possibly forever, Britain is locked into the single European market, but with no capacity to change the rules and no capacity to do any trade deals for itself. The Remainers, some of them at least, are prepared to concede that Britain will leave the political union, but all of them still insist that it must stay in the economic one because deep down they fear that Britain can't cope on its own. Yet, this is the country that has seen off the Spanish Armada, the French Emperor and the German Kaiser, against Louis XIV, against Napoleon, against Willem II, and then against Hitler. This country did not need Europe. It saved Europe, helped as it always should be by its friends and family, the Commonwealth across the sea. This is the home of the mother of parliaments, of the Industrial Revolution, and of the world's common language. That's right. The modern world has been made in English. So no country on earth should be more capable than Britain of standing on its own 2 feet. And that, surely, is what's crying out now for remembrance amidst all the declinism and defeatism, because if Brexit fails, Britain fails. Deciding to leave the EU but failing to carry it through wouldn't just be a normal failure, like failing to build the HS2 or to extend Heathrow. It would be defeat on an epic scale, hardly matched since the Norman invasion, a national humiliation to echo down the ages, shattering to all who have ever looked to this country for inspiration. You see, not for nothing is it the British flag that's again seen on the streets of Hong Kong, 22 years after its people last truly knew freedom under the law. If they thought that Britain would be lost in Europe as they fear being lost in China, they'd hardly be carrying your flag. For them, it's a symbol of freedom. And for you, surely, a source of pride in all you have done and all you yet can do. So, let me assure anyone in Britain anxious about the prospect of a no-deal Brexit that Australia does $100 billion worth of trade with the EU every single year on the basis of no deal. And sure, we do have some trade facilitation arrangements. These arise from the mutual self-interest that exists between any two entities that wish to do business with each other, regardless of whether they are in some form of political union. Come to think of it, Britain, yes, Britain, already does 55% of its trade with countries outside the EU on the basis of no deal. Indeed, it's not Britain's trade with the EU that's growing, but the trade it does with the rest of the world on a no-deal basis. Trade with people who want to buy British goods and British services because they're worth buying, not because they're in a political union. And I know something about trade deals because my government did them. Trade deals covering almost 50% of our exports with Japan, with Korea, and with China. You can do them, but you have to know what you want, you have to be in charge of your own country, and your negotiating partners have to know, and this is the exact phrase, that no deal is better than a bad deal. Now, a full economic partnership between Britain and Australia, restoring the almost completely unrestricted commerce that we enjoyed for 150 years, and allowing Britons and Australians once again properly to experience each other's wonderful countries and lives, that would be about the best 2019 Christmas present our two countries could have. And frankly, had our negotiators not been so timidly respectful of the EU's rules, it could have been ready to sign and to commence from the 31st of October, so that Britain would not be going into the world alone. There should be no easier deal to do than one between Britain and Australia. And with a new Prime Minister in charge and with a new Minister pushing hard, it certainly should be signed, sealed and delivered this year. You see, none of this is all that complicated, and it need even be all that hard. Yet that, it seems to me, is what officialdom's reluctance has made everything to do with Brexit. You've been so preoccupied with what Europe might expect that you've neglected to plan for what you must do. For almost 50 years, goods have been freely traded between Britain and the countries of the EU without tariff or quota or hold-ups at the border. Offer to keep that. For almost 50 years, something that could be sold in France, say, could be sold in Britain, and more or less, someone who was qualified to work in France could work in Britain, and vice versa. There's been full mutual recognition of standards and credentials. Offer to keep that. Millions of people have come here from the continent to live and work. They're good people. Let them stay as long as they like and become citizens if they wish, and ask the same for Britons in Europe. And as for the future, if people from Europe or elsewhere can come here to contribute for work, not welfare, and maybe their bosses can pay a foreign workers tax too in order to ensure that no one's wages are being undercut within numerical limits, those people should have the same big-hearted welcome to Britain as they've long had. And Britain should seek the same for its citizens in Europe. Now, with goodwill on Europe's part, this could be agreed on the spot, because it's essentially maintaining what's always been for the past 50 years. It would be what's best for Europe and what's best for Britain. Indeed, better for them than for you, because Britain is a better market for Europe than the other way round, and Britain is a better economic opportunity for Europeans than the other way round. And if the Europeans, to punish Britain, want to cut off their nose to spite their face, Britain could do it anyway, unilaterally. And that way, if there was a hard border anywhere, including in Ireland, it wouldn't be Britain's doing, it would be Europe's. It wouldn't be Britain that was shutting out Europe, but Europe that would be shutting out Britain. And in the long run, Europe has more to lose. Now, the Europeans know that. That's why they are so assiduously trying to exploit the fear of no deal to bluff Britain into becoming an economic colony, stuck in the customs union, but with no say whatsoever over making the rules. And that's why Britain has to be ready to walk away with no deal to have any hope of getting a good one. As far as Britain is concerned, Brexit need change nothing unless Britain decides it should. Post-Brexit, all existing EU rules would apply in Britain until Britain decides otherwise. But no future EU rules would apply in Britain unless Britain decided they should. No future EU tribunal decisions would apply in Britain. And no further payments would be made by Britain to the EU, not £39 billion, not even £9 billion, other than for specific common projects that Britain chooses to participate in. You see, like parties to a bad marriage, Britain and the EU should make a clean break, and once done with it, will probably surprise themselves at how much better they can then get on. Still, the next few weeks will be full of political fury as Remainers plot to sabotage Brexit or to turn it into a self-vindicating disaster. They will fail, though, because in the end, there won't be enough of them to usurp a democratic vote, to sacrifice their country for short-term political gain, and to put Europe before Britain. As the scripture says, he who puts his hand to the plough and then turns back is not worthy of the kingdom. Finally, let me offer this reassurance that if there is one thing that writing a fine book on Churchill would have done for Britain's new Prime Minister, it is readying him for this challenge and to call it for Britain. This is his moment of destiny, as much as this country's, and I am sure that he feels that his whole life has been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And I know that with 27 EU countries now lined up against you, Some because they don't want to lose a friend at court. Others because they fear being upstaged by a Britain where people can so much more easily get things done. You must often feel alone and full of doubt. How could you not? But know this. There are some 160 other countries out there, too polite to take sides right now, but ready to welcome you back into a wider world, back into a bigger family, nearly all of them willing you to succeed and just wanting you to get this done. Get this done. That's what Britain must do now. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. It's an absolute honour to be here. These are fraught times for Britain, but they are exhilarating times for Britain's friends as it prepares to reclaim its freedom.
Our guest of honour has very kindly agreed to answer questions. Usual House rules, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. Gentleman there, second row, name and organisation.
John Moynihan, private individual. Tony, welcome back and thank you for your usual wonderful common sense and refreshingly clear exposition of the situation. My question is, how would you characterise the expected political as well as economic consequences of agreeing to Theresa May's withdrawal deal if the backstop is removed, as has been hinted at by this government?
Well, anything that leaves Britain in the customs union for an indefinite period is not really Brexit. And as this struggle has gone on, I sense that the British people have come to realise just how hostile to them and their interests the whole EU apparatus is. And my sense is that despite the sound and fury from the institution over the road, that the British people are more determined now to take back control than they were 2.5, 3 years ago.
What were the political consequences of doing that?
Well, to stay in the customs union, but without any say in it, would be, as I said in the speech, it would be a humiliation on an epic scale. And I don't believe anyone with Britain's best interests at heart would want that to happen.
Gentleman there, then gentleman there. Name and organisation, please. Sorry, if you'll just wait till the microphone so we can hear your question. Name and
Craig Beaumont from the Federation of Small Businesses here. I wondered what your advice would be to the UK government on immigration, as the Australian points-based system is almost legendary now over here, but that isn't actually a great method to reduce immigration if that's what you're trying to do. I wondered what your advice would be. Well,
naturally, everything that Australia does is the best in the world, particularly cricket. Oopsie days, have I lost this?
No, you're okay, I think.
Okay. So
everyone here?
I'm not going to say anything against the Australian point system, but even things that we do in Australia can always be improved. The great thing about the point system is that it attempts to ensure that everyone coming as a permanent resident and prospective new citizen of our country is capable of making a contribution. And if you are capable of making a contribution, and the best way to ensure that that is the case is if you are coming to do a job from day one, pay taxes from day one, integrate with your workmates from day one, as long as you're not undercutting the wages of existing workers, hey, come on in, come on in. You probably have to put a cap on numbers because Britain is such a desirable location and you don't want the place swamped with people trying to make the most of a new life here. But nevertheless, if people are coming to join the team. If people are coming to improve the country, well, they are potentially wonderful migrants.
Gentleman there. No, in front of you.
Oh.
Name an organisation, please.
Thank you. Chris Waterman, commentator and contrarian.
Yeah.
It's great to sit at your feet. I too am a keen student of Mr. Johnson. I'm not sure if you've read 72 Virgins as well as his book on Churchill.
No, but I'd be happy to meet them, though.
Well, if you know where you do meet 72 Virgins, I don't think you'd be so keen on that. But and you mentioned cricket.
You obviously have more intelligence on these things than I do. But
You mentioned cricket, and I won't sandpaper over the cracks about your Australian cricket team. But what I'm interested in, and you quoted everything going back, I think you got back to the Bible.
the New Testament, not the Old Testament.
Okay, I'll forgive you that. But you said that a bad marriage, it's best to have a clean break. Mm-hmm. What happens to the children, my children?
Well, the children of British people are very lucky because they are citizens of a wonderful country with a wonderful future. But it will be so much better a future if it is controlled by the British Parliament rather than simply having to share control with the faceless bureaucrats of Brussels. That's all.
Gentleman there. There.
John McTernan, I'm a commentator and journalist, and like you, someone who loves Australia as much as he loves Great Britain. My question is, Australia as a small country has prospered amongst much larger countries, neighbours and non-neighbours. Post-Brexit, our country is going to have to manoeuvre between big blocs like the European Union, larger economies like China, the US, India. Looking back over the decades of Australia's undoubted success, what are the elements of what Australia did, kind of bipartisan elements, that made Australia the success it is today? What can we learn here from Australia?
Look, it's a very good question, and thank you for being here, John. Obviously, you've made a significant contribution in my country as well as here. Look, the best thing that you can do is have a good attitude and go for it. We have two great phrases in Australia: the fair go. So if you see someone who's doing it tough, you do your best to ensure that the helping hand is provided. The other great phrase is have a go, because there's a wonderful world out there, and if you have a go, it's amazing what you'll achieve. But if you sit on your backside complaining, if you sit on your backside waiting for someone else to fix things for you, you might wait a very long time. So look, that have a go instinct, which has served Australia so well, I reckon is exactly the spirit we need in Britain right now.
Just trying to get a sense of how many more questions. Lady there in the middle.
Hello, Sarah Nixon from the Institute for Government. Thanks, Tony, for your talk. Reflecting on both your experience as a Member of Parliament and thinking about the choices that MPs in Britain will have to make on the votes this week and further ahead, how do you think, I'm interested in your reflections on how you think a Member of Parliament should balance their own views and the views of their constituents in making these difficult choices? Okay,
well look, we had a not entirely dissimilar situation in Australia on a very different subject, same-sex marriage. My government decided that should be put to a plebiscite of the people, and the plebiscite was very overwhelmingly in favour, and it then had to go back to the Parliament for the relevant legislation to be debated and then passed. I was not in favour of same-sex marriage, although I absolutely accept that now that it's happened, it's the law of the land and it should stay the law of the land. But I had to weigh what to do. And my view was, once the Parliament decides that something which would normally be in its purview is to be handed to the public for adjudication, you've got to respect the public's position. Once the people have spoken, that really is the end of the matter. So what the parliamentarians, in my mind, must do is facilitate Brexit. And the advice I would give them most strongly is that anything that looks like it sabotages Brexit is just playing into the hands of people who don't want what's best for Britain.
Lady in the front row.
Thank you, Tony, Prime Minister. I just want to say your speech is...
Name and organisation.
Sorry, Sophie de Schwartzberg-Gunter, Capital Strategy. Thank you for your speech. Very moving, and I completely agree with everything you said. I voted for Brexit. What I would like you to do, just to build on the question from behind, is the Remainers are saying that people did not vote for no deal. So they're saying that the question put in the plebiscite was not the question that's being debated. So how would you argue that position?
Well, they voted to leave, and obviously they want to leave under the best possible circumstances. But as Theresa May said back then, no deal is better than a bad deal. And the problem with Theresa May's deal, and look, I don't wish to sound disrespectful or critical of someone who did her best in a very difficult job for 3 years, but the problem with her deal is that it was a very bad deal, because it kept Britain in the customs union without having any say over the customs union, which in my opinion is the worst of all possible worlds. So the British people wanted the best possible deal. What they were given or offered by Theresa May was a very bad deal, and there should be no going back to that whatsoever.
Lady there in the middle. Name and organisation.
Dawn Friedman, Jewish Women's Aid. The examples you gave of Britain's glory days are somewhat historic, if I may say so. And my question is, looking today at our statesmen and our infrastructure, do we really have the ability to stand on our own feet and go for it?
Well, I look a couple of thousand miles to a little place called Israel. 7 million people, not 60 million people, 7 million people, surrounded by neighbours who hate it far more than the EU hates Britain. And somehow Israel magnificently stands on its own 2 feet. Now, if Israel can do it with 7 million in the world's worst neighbourhood, surely Britain can do it so much more readily in a much better neighbourhood.
Gentleman at the back.
I'd be very interested
Organisation.
Warwick Lightfoot, I'm Head of Economics and Social Policy here at Policy Exchange. I'd be very intrigued to take your mind on the role of referenda and plebiscites within a parliamentary system. I'm attracted by Dyce's interest in referenda, who of course was the person who perfected the notion of the sovereignty of Parliament. And from your own experience in Australia, which has made much more use of plebiscites than we have ever done here, why don't you give us some guidance on your judgment about their utility?
Okay, well look, we have a formal procedure under our Constitution for changing the Constitution via referenda, and there are very strict procedures. The proposal has got to be absolutely precisely worked out, and then a question has to be put to the people based on a specific bill. Are you in favour of a bill to amend the Constitution in these terms? Now, that's not what happened here, obviously, and it's not what happened with the Australian plebiscite on same-sex marriage, and it's not what happened with the Australian plebiscites on conscription back in World War I. My own view is that plebiscites should be very rarely used. But on great issues which are incredibly personal, I do think it is fair and reasonable to say that the wisdom of the whole people is better than simply the wisdom of the Parliament. The last thing you would want to do is go to the people every other year. Parliament should be more than capable of running the business of the nation 99.9% of the time. But once in a generation, maybe, when things of enormous moment are coming before the country, I think it's right and proper to go to the people and ask them their view. But once the people have expressed their view, the Parliament, whatever the formal legal position, is ethically, morally and politically bound to give effect to what the people have said.
Shall we take the last questions as a clutch?
Yeah, sure.
Just can I get a sense of who else wants to ask a question? We'll take them as a group. One more. Lady there in the middle by the aisle.
What about if they all say their question? I'll give a collective answer.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a good.
Alvaray from the New Statesman. So I think maybe your boldest comment during that speech was that if a hard border were to be erected on the island of Ireland, that would be the fault of Europe and not of the UK. Do you not have any concerns about the ramifications for peace and stability on the island of Ireland if that were the case? And also, if none of this is that difficult, what would your proposed solution be to the backstop question?
Okay, next question. We're going to get all the questions out. Which ones to answer?
I'm glad I could get a word in. Yeah. Natasha Icknes, I work for a Minister of State and Transport, George Freeman. I'm Australian as well. Tony, my question is, coming up to an election, whenever that does happen, there is a high sense of anxiety at the moment in Westminster, especially in the Conservatives, who are the most successful political party in the world in history. But I'm also quite proud of the Liberal Party's record in Australia off the back of Scott Morrison's win as well. What's your message? Because you've given a great pep talk today, I think. We'll have the conference at the end of September because whatever happens in the election manifesto, the Conservatives have to look beyond Brexit. Yep. There is a vision beyond that. It will be fought on a divisive issue, but Boris's vision, which is already being laid out, what is your key message to hold the Conservatives together? Because in order to get it done, that's what has to happen, in my view.
Who else?
There's a gentleman right up the back.
Somebody right at the back.
Thank you. James McCann from IBSE, which is the Freelancers Association. What does Britain need to do to stay at the forefront of global competitiveness? It's a very much a changing world. Technology is changing. Digital technology is coming in. What are your views does Britain need to do, particularly after Brexit, to stay globally competitive?
Okay.
Anyone else? Do I see anyone else? No. Lord Trimble, as the only British Nobel Peace Prize winner, I just wondered whether you wanted to say something in the light of the question on the Irish border.
It's a largely bogus issue.
David, they've got a microphone for you. There's a microphone there for you, David.
Right there. It's largely a bogus issue. Bogus in the sense that some Brussels people, together, I'm afraid, with a very poor Irish Prime Minister, have thought that they could manipulate this process to their own political advantage. And I'm afraid things are coming home to roost quite soon.
Thank you, Tony.
Okay, well, look, to the lady from the New Statesman, I'm going to defer to my noble and learned friend Lord Trimble on the question of the Irish border because he is an undoubted expert in a way that I'm not. As for the other questions, look, global competitiveness, Britain already has very competitive tax rates by the standards of developed countries. I think the most attractive thing for footloose global capital and people who really want to make the most of their lives is a light touch regulatory environment. And I think all of our countries are too ready to solve problems with more regulation rather than simply sacking the idiot that made the bad decision and telling people to use more common sense next time. So that would be my advice to post-Brexit Britain. Make a bonfire of the regulations, and that will make your country incredibly attractive to everyone from around the world. As for the Conservative Party, look, you're absolutely right. It is an extraordinary political machine which has done a wonderful job for Britain over centuries, and through its work been marvellous for the wider world. Look, what do the people want? Occasionally, in moments of great national peril or trial, the people will want people to stand up for their country. And that's exactly what I believe that under Boris Johnson, the Conservative Party is now doing. But in between times, they want their lives made easier, not harder. I mean, the best advice for any politician is the first line of the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. If you can't do good, don't do anything. But if you can make it easier for people to earn more, do it. If you can leave a bit more in people's pockets at the end of the week, do it. If you can try to reduce their bills, great. If you can try to make it easier for their kids to get a job, easier for their kids to buy a house, do all those things. And if you do that, and don't worry too much about the finer points of ideology or economics, you can have arguments amongst yourselves by all means about that. But if you give the people what common sense would dictate, there's no reason why you can't succeed magnificently. And look, I understand all politicians are nervous with an election coming up, but I would think that the easiest election to fight and win is an election where you are saying to the people, I'm on your side. I'm on your side. Look at all those people over there who look like they've done well out of the EU, telling you that you're dumb, you're old, you're stupid, you don't know what's best for you. I am on your side. So if it is an election that pits the Parliament versus the people and the people's champion, well, I know which side I'd rather be working for.
Before concluding proceedings, I just want to, because this event has taken place at delightfully short notice, to say thank you to Robert Hansard, our head of events, and Julia Misden for throwing this event, and many others for throwing this event together at such short notice. Please join me in expressing It's now my great pleasure to call upon Right Honourable Elizabeth Truss MP, Secretary of State for International Trade, President of the Board of Trade, indeed, I think still in the full plenitude of her title, been a great friend to us, been a great friend to Australia. I know you've made heroic efforts to hot-foot it from a late cabinet meeting this morning, so we're delighted that you've broken that engagement to be with us. Thank you, Liz.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, for that tour de force. It's brilliant having you in the UK at the moment, just as we are poised to make our way in the world, and to have your moral support is fantastic. And it's also fascinating to see that you are so much more committed to Brexit than many of our own countrymen. But you were born in London and you studied PPE at Oxford University, so that is no surprise to me. And what struck me most in your remarks is you telling us what we all know deep inside is that we can do this. We are a great country. We are going to succeed. There are lots of opportunities out there, and we need to be positive and we need to grasp those opportunities. And to me, this is not the first time that you have given Conservatives hope. I remember in the aftermath of the financial crisis, when a lot of right-wing politicians around the world were saying we need to retreat, we need to give ground, we need to become a bit more triangulated, we need to be a bit more technocratic, we need to allow the arguments for big government to proceed, we just need to tack a bit this way or tack a bit that way. You are out there being a proud Conservative. You are out there saying that arguments about freedom, arguments about personal responsibility can win if you make them and you believe in the courage of your convictions. You told us about axe the tax, about stop the waste, about hope, reward and opportunity. And I think you inspired lots of politicians around the world, including me, who were worried about the domination of the technocrats of the I know we've got a few Blairites in this room, but those types of people. And you said that it's fine, that we can be unapologetic about being Conservatives, because we understand what motivates people. We understand people do want the freedom to live their own lives. They don't want the government telling them what to do. They do want to be able to go out there, earn money and do the best for their families. And I think that was hugely inspiring. I remember when you came over in the coalition government days and you came to talk to me about childcare reform. So I remember thinking how much more liberal you were than Nick Clegg about those reforms. And yet again, Tony, you were an inspiration. So as we are on the verge of this important time for Britain, what brilliant friends we have in Australia. What brilliant friends we have who are supporting us every moment of our journey into becoming an independent, free trading nation, because we will take back control of our laws, our rules and regulations and our sovereignty. And that will enable us to strike free trade deals across the world with countries like the US, Australia, New Zealand and Japan. Many of them free democracies that believe in free markets and free enterprise. And I think that's incredibly important. And I've already been talking with my counterpart, Simon Birmingham in Australia. I'm afraid to say he said some rather rash things about the Ashes, which I'm hoping that he'll have to take back when I go to Australia in a few weeks' time. But I believe that as you've promised, that you're saying, Tony, that we can do a deal by Christmas, I certainly say that I want it to be one of the first deals that we strike. I know that we have got a fantastic relationship between our two nations. I know that we can make trade even better and bigger. And one of the things I'm most envious about with Australian politics is that you have a sausage sizzle at your elections. And what I want is I want British sausages to be on that sausage sizzle by the next Australian election. And I want to make sure that it's a Liberal government that gets elected again in Australia and a Conservative government that gets elected again here in Britain. And we can carry on leading the world in free trade, in individual liberty and personal responsibility. And I know, Tony, that you will not tire in continuing to make that case. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for inspiring us. Thank you so much for your optimism. It's great. And I'm looking forward to coming to see you in Australia to further the cause even more. Thank you.